Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started. I'm Elizabeth Donahue. I'm the Associate Dean here for Public Affairs and Communications, and welcome to today's talk. So the question on the table today is, how is someone able to be a conservative in the age of Trump? I don't know the answer to that, and so I invited David Frum to come to the school, and he's going to tell us today. For those of you who follow David, you know that he is a leading conservative political commentator. He's a contributor on CNN, and he's a senior editor at The Atlantic magazine. He was one of the earliest and most prominent conservative voices to come out in unrelenting opposition to President Trump. He said that Trump is, quote unquote, shattering the safeguards that protect democracy. His forthcoming book, Trumpocracy, The Corruption of the American Republic, will be released early next year. In 2007 and 2008, David was a senior policy advisor to the presidential campaign of Rudy Giuliani. And from 2001 to 2002, he served as a special assistant and speechwriter for President George W. Bush. He's the author of 9 books, including the first insider book of the Bush presidency called The Right Man, an Insider Account of the Bush White House. After leaving the White House, David was a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and in 2005, he formed and led the group Americans for Better Justice, which spearheaded the opposition of Harriet Miers to the U.S. Supreme Court. So please welcome David Frum.
Thank you, and thank you to Princeton for this extraordinary welcome and this beautiful hall on this beautiful day. What a pleasure to be here. I have mostly been here on tours with my various children of the universities of the East Coast. This is a rather, actually less stressful visit than any of those. The worst that can happen is that I can fail, and those of you who are parents will know that is easy. It's when you're, it's your kid's disappointment. And I'll be back. I'll be back in about 18 months with child number 3. Hoping to get in some goodwill early. The question that I'm asked to address today is a rather more personal one than I'm accustomed to talking about in the Trump era. Things come at you so fast, and they are of such public moment. And while not everyone is of global significance, sometimes the smallest of the incidents are the most upsetting, and we have been having those in the past 48 hours. They serve among their costs to obscure some important positive things that happen in the world. Today, or in the past news cycle, the capital of the ISIS-held territory in Mesopotamia has fallen. Raqqa has been liberated by anti-ISIS forces. And one would imagine that an American president would have many things to say on such an occasion. The idea that he's gotten into the personal Twitter feud with the widow of a fallen soldier is among the less probable things that would happen. But the great thing for me about this topic is that it allows me to talk about some of the things that tend to get obscured in this era of remap politics. I do find myself often saying things to different audiences from those that I have been used to speak to, and receiving a different kind of welcome from those that I have been used to speak to. And while it's always nice to get an affirmative welcome, it sometimes worries me that things are going a little bit too easily, both for me personally and for the audience. I think we all need to think harder together. So so the fun for me today, and I hope it will be interesting for you, is that I get to talk about some of the ways in which I see politics is continuous, and to see where I've personally ended up, and perhaps where some of you have ended up, as continuous with past commitments. I have had friends who have made various kinds of pieces, more or less willing, more or less enthusiastic, more or less principled, more or less opportunistic with the new regime in Washington. Washington is a company town. It is like Hollywood if Hollywood were small. If Los Angeles were a city of 500,000 instead of a vast metropolis. And so you cannot escape the fact of this presidency, and you cannot escape continued contact with people. These are often people with whom you have carpooled. These are people with whom you have served in past administrations. These are neighbors. These are people with whom you go to synagogue. So you discuss these things. And one of the things that you hear a lot is accusations of bad faith. And you are told, if you were truly committed to the principles that you have, you would follow me as I go in these new directions. And so when you ask, well, what are the new directions? How do you explain what you are doing? Well, the thing you have to understand is our political system is so rotten. Things are so bad that we need convulsive action. There was a famous essay written during the campaign, the Flight 93 election, which said that the choice was basically staying in your seat and certainly being smashed, or charging the cockpit and probably being smashed. But either way, death loomed. The only solution was radical, revolutionary upheaval aimed at burning the system to the ground. And that's what it means to be a true conservative. And I would say, well, what about those of us who are basically satisfied with the way things are, who would like to see a few reforms at the margins, but basically want to conserve, who feel that politics we have more to lose than to gain from politics, who want to retain things as they are? What word do we get to use? Because if conservatism is the word we use to describe what the arsonists do, what is the word for the people who want to stop the arson and preserve the American Republic in more or less its previous form? We need a word too, and we have not got one. So that is what I want to talk to you about today. What do I want to conserve? We have been living through a quarter century in which the dominant fashionable idea has been that the nation is a problem. The nation needs to be dissolved into something bigger, a multinational community like the European Union, a global community, the brotherhood of man, as Lord Tennyson called it in that famous poem, Locksley Hall, that the nation is too small, too violent, too exclusive, too stained with the crimes of the 20th century, and we need to move beyond that. And the hope was that if we did that, we would find that people had wider loyalties and broader commitments. And that we needed no longer to heed the ideas of the revolutionaries of the 1840s, the Union cause of the United States in the 1860s that said that if you're going to citizenship and democracy is bound to nation states. That's an old-fashioned idea. And I happen still to believe it. What I have been, the foundational idea of my conservatism, there are really two. The first is the necessity of strong nations, because only through strong nations can you have democracy. And the second is the need for American leadership of the world system, because without American leadership, the world system does not function. So it is that while preserving the strength and unity of all nations is important, preserving the strength and cohesion of this nation is especially important. And I say that not out of chauvinism. I was born in Canada. I continue to spend a lot of time in Canada. I have a house in Canada. I have a business in Canada. I see things very much through Canadian eyes. And one of the things that you learn from that experience is to say that there is no difference between American, as we say, as you see here from people on the left in the Cold War, that there's no difference between the American and the Soviet nationality, that these are two peas in a pod. My answer to that was always, that is to say that there's no difference in the history of Canada in the history of Poland. And speaking from Toronto, I can tell you there is a lot of difference between the history of Canada and the history of Poland, and that the strength and unity and power of the United States has been the thing that has made the world system work. To send justice out into the world without power is to send justice out into the world to be a victim. Justice must always be backed by power, or it is futile. And that is my bedrock conviction. What I have seen happening in American life since the end of the Cold War, the advent of the internet, the advent of globalization, some of this driven by technology, the container ship, some of it driven by policy decisions, the decision in the early 1990s to double the intake of legal immigration, and then the decision after that not to work very hard to stop illegal immigration. With the result that the United States has had a migration surge since the middle 80s, as great relative to its population as that which we last experienced during the age of mass production before the First World War, has been a weakening of the bonds of Americans to each other, a weakening of bonds between Americans and the state, a weakening of commitment to American nationality. That is how it is possible for a Russian spy to walk into an American political campaign and say, I have information about your opponent. Would you like it? And for that campaign to answer, love it. If you can imagine the answer that the Gerald Ford for President campaign would have given if they'd been offered that information about Jimmy Carter, you have seen the distance that we have traveled. That spy would be held until the FBI arrived. That is the vision of nation that Americans had. But that vision of nation is what is operationally a conservative idea in this country. I have to face, however, that that kind of conservatism is a little bit out of style. And I sometimes think, when I think about the way politics evolves, of what it would mean to be somebody who was born in the 1830s in a family that hated the presidency of Andrew Jackson and that absorbed at an early age the sacred principles of Henry Clay, canals and banks and the importance of industrial development. And you would grow up with those ideas, and then the Civil War would come, and perhaps you participated in it, and then perhaps you lived a long life by the standards of the time, and you made it into your 70s, and you lived almost to the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt. Now you might carry with you through life the principles you'd learned as a young person. You might go on believing in the importance of central banks. You might go on believing in the importance of industrial development. But it would be pretty ridiculous in 1885 to call yourself a Whig. I mean, you might be Whiggish, you might carry that impress with you for life, but the political map would have been rearranged, and you would have to find new identities. We have lived for a period, a quarter of a century, through some pretty frozen politics. I imagine someone, Rip Van Winkle, falling asleep in the year 1990. The original Rip Van Winkle fell asleep for only 20 years, but people live longer now, so let's give this guy 25 years. And our Rip Van Winkle wakes up not in 2015, a quarter of a century later, and sort of groggily realizes what has happened, groggily realizes that he has entered a new election cycle, and asks, who's running? And is told, oh, Bush and Clinton. What are they talking about? Oh, healthcare and taxes. Has anything changed? No, it's all really basically the same. We had 25 years of quite frozen politics, and where what were the strong Democratic states in 1990 were stronger Democratic states in 2015. What were strong Republican states in 1990 were stronger Republican states in 2015. It was the same, only more so. It polarized, it became more intense, but it didn't change its shape. For a country that is so dynamic, this is a very strange thing. And there is not another quarter-century period in American history where things are so consistently stable. But one of the things that has been changing is the map of political power in this country has been deviating farther and farther from the map of economic and cultural power. The Republican Party today holds power on a scale unmatched since the 1920s. Two-thirds of united control of 3/5 of the states, Assembly, Senate, and governorship. Having reduced the Democratic Party's hold in the states to the lowest level since Reconstruction. United Republican control of all the houses of all the elected institutions in Washington, D.C., and with a majority on the Supreme Court, something that, again, Republicans have not had since the 1920s. But when Herbert Hoover sat atop that kind of Republican power in 1928, after the election of 1928, he led a party that not only that dominated the country politically, but that was also dominant in the areas of dynamic life. That in the election of 1928, in the financial center of the United States, the state of New York, Hoover won 55% of the vote. In Pennsylvania, the industrial center of the United States, he won 65% of the vote. And in the gleaming hub of the new economy, the state of Michigan, where they made cars, this new fantastic new high technology industry of the 1920s, the Republicans won 75% of the presidential vote. Today, while the Republicans dominate politically, where songs are written and movies are made, where products are invented and technologies developed, that is where the Republican Party is not. And we have had this deviation of political power from cultural power in a way that has never been seen. I could tell you the same story, by the way, about the heyday of the Democratic ascendancy, about 1965, when they had the same kind of power that the Republicans had in 1928, and they too were strong in what were the centers of the new economy of their day. It's not as strong a story as in the 1920s, as remarkable as that, but it's the same idea. The idea that you would have that Lyndon Johnson would run the country, but he would be completely cut off from where cultural and economic power came from. So we need a new synthesis and a new map, and so conservatism does have to change. Politics is like an exam, where every time solve a problem, your reward is to be confronted with a new and completely unfamiliar problem. I was on the Colbert Show years ago, and I made this point, and Colbert said, well, doesn't that make it kind of a waste of time to solve problems then? Which is a philosophical way to think about it. But here are the things that we have to take with us, in my opinion, as we go, and the enduring commitment. Societies are always divided between those who have more to lose from politics than they have to gain. Societies are always divided between those who think that the way the country is organized basically makes sense, basically works, is basically fair, and by people who have suggestions for change. Society is dominated by those who feel that they have a continuous stake in the history of the country, and society is divided between them and people who feel that they are presenting some kind of new claim or challenge to the ways that the country is organized. And all of those things are where conservatism has a role. The great challenge for democratic societies is how do you keep your conservatives vested? One of the things that we learned in the dark years of the early part of the 20th century is that when the status quo forces in society no longer believe that they can prevail in democratic competition, and when conservatives believe that their interests are no longer served by competing in electoral politics, they don't give up on their interests, they give up on democracy. And that is the story of the first 35 years, the first 40 years of the 20th century. And so it's important for conservative parties, conservative ideas to remain highly, highly competitive and to organize in ways that can protect existing interests. This is, I think, from my point of view, the reason I stay involved in Republican politics, because I see a party that is in danger of pessimism, of apocalyptic despair, of believing, as Donald Trump said, that if we don't win in 2016, we will never win a democratic election again. And the thought that you come to, if you believe that, which I don't, but if you believe that, the thought you come to is, well, in that case, if we'd either win, and if we don't win, then we're going to have to give up on the democratic system. So what do I think the conservatism of the future looks like? I think it begins with a strong commitment to American nationhood. It begins with a sense that Americans are indeed Americans first. A phrase, by the way, coined not by Charles Lindbergh, to whom it is often credited, but by the man for whom this building is named. It was his slogan in the election of 1916. He used it, in my opinion, for the mistaken goal of keeping America out of the First World War, a war I believe that the United States should have entered faster than it did. But nonetheless, that's the origin of the slogan. It was in the Wilson campaign of 1916. That idea that, that Americans have a special tie to their own country. It begins with a reaffirmation of the institutions of the central nation. It begins by making citizenship an elevated thing. In practical terms, what that is going to mean is strong institutions, strong borders, a more restrictive immigration policy than the country has had in the past, and a stronger commitment to assimilating the enormous inflow of immigrants the country has received. since the middle 1980s. We are again at the same level of the foreign-born as we were in 1913, the previous peak, but it is going to grow relatively faster because in 1913 the native-born population was having lots of children, whereas today they're not. So immigrants and their children are going to be a larger and larger share of the population through the 21st century because of decisions already made, and making Americans out of them in a world that is global is going to be very, very difficult. This is a world in which it's very easy to remain in contact with the places you came from. I'm an example. I'm born in Canada. I still have a house there. I go there all the time. I do have some divided commitments between the United States and Canada. That's pretty easy because there are no two countries in the world that are more closely integrated and more similar than the United States and Canada. But the same thing would be true for my good friends who have similar kinds of relationships with Mexico or with India, or a little bit more ominously with China, a country that is going to be a great power competitor. Making Americans out of Americans is the first principle. That's going to mean some things that are congenial to conservatism and some things that are more challenging, because you're going to have to find ways to thicken the bonds of citizenship in material terms. What does it mean? What do you get? As societies become more diverse, that the bond between citizen and nation is going to be inevitably less cultural. It means it's going to have to be a little bit more institutional and economic. In England, as England has become more diverse, what you've seen is ever greater emphasis on the National Health Service as a bond that binds citizens to each other. If it doesn't matter where you came from or how recently, if you've become a British citizen, you're in the NHS, and it doesn't matter how long your family lived in England. If you emigrate to Bermuda to get a lower tax rate, you're out of the NHS. And the existence of the National Health Service becomes a tangible symbol of what it means to be not English ethnically, but British as a citizen. I think America will need more things like that. And I think that's one of the reasons why, in addition to the obvious pragmatic reasons, why the United States needs a more universal approach to health care, there's a citizen reason. It needs to give people, many of whom have demonstrated by their vote for Donald Trump, feel they don't have a stake in the system, something tangible that comes with the passport that makes you an American. I think the conservatism of the future needs to re-articulate a defense of the market economy. When the people began to use the word neoliberal as an epithet, at first I thought it was a joke, because what does it mean? But I realize increasingly seriously, I mean, it means everything and nothing, but it does mean everything, and it means basically everything. The people who are attacking it are attacking everything that I think a party of enterprise needs to stand for: the free enterprise system, for global open trade, for respect for settled property agreements. Those are important things. The conservatism of the future needs to look a little bit more like the Henry Clay Whiggism of the past, with its focus on building the physicality of the nation: roads and highways and bridges and internet connections and ports that work, and that make the country look and feel like something that people can be proud of. There are very practical reasons why you want your ports and airports and roads to work, but you also want people to feel, as they walk about them, inspired that they belong to something great. That there is something when you walk through American public institutions that you feel a little bit like you're in a defeated country, a country that can't do things anymore. A country in which the only thing that matters is who you personally are, not who your nation is and who your fellow citizens are. And I think this infusion of meaning means an infusion of meaning into the symbols and history of the nation, and into the way you remember the past. Some of these, both in its good forms and in its bad forms, and to be honest with yourself about where you have been and who you have been. Electoral competition is, in my view, a profoundly good thing. If you get to the airport and the people who represent United and American Airlines say, we've decided to put aside the foolish squabbling of the past and work together on providing a joint, shared, bipartisan approach to transportation solutions. You have a pretty good idea that's going to come at your expense. The job of politics is to refine the choice for the voter. And I have always been suspicious of projects that try to find centrist, moderate solutions that Michael Bloomberg style, all people of goodwill can agree with, because that turns out to be all people of a certain shared background, shared point of view, a shared class set of assumptions. What is needed is effective competition, where the problems flow from the bottom of society up toward the political elite, and where political elites then compete to devise solutions and to win democratic consent and permission to implement their solutions. And that is sharpened through competition. Bipartisanship is often a way to avoid making meaningful decisions where decisions are necessary. So that question of whether you want a more expensive government that taxes more and delivers more, or a less expensive government that taxes less and delivers less, that's ultimately a values choice. It's ultimately a sub-rational choice, and it's ultimately a choice that has to be competed for. If what you want to do is have a larger military that takes a more forward position, something I would advocate, that is something that needs to be argued for. We have just discovered through tragedy that there are Americans in Niger. Why? Well, no one's ever asked your consent or permission or told you what they're doing there. You don't know there are true American troops in Mali where they've taken casualties. Why? What are they doing? Those are things that need to be debated. There's obviously a need for secrecy in government in its appropriate place, but the United States has drifted into a lot of commitments without real meaningful discussion. Let's have that discussion. And that requires, above all, and this is where I will end, I think the truest ethic of a conservative politics, which is one where people accept responsibility, where people, instead of being shy about some of the inevitable unfairnesses and advantages of life, accept responsibility for them. A great Princetonian, maybe the greatest artist ever to have attended Princeton, F. Scott Fitzgerald, opened his greatest novel with the paragraph that included the line, whenever, advice from a father to a son, whenever you are tempted to be critical of anybody, remember that not everybody in life has had the advantages that you have had. And I know that sentence well because my late mother used to quote it to me all the time before I realized it was a quotation. Now, Nick Carraway is a more complicated cat than is necessary to delve into for purposes of this lecture, and there's more ambiguity in that sentence than it needs to be. But from my point of view, they should carve it on the lintels of Congress and print it on the $20 bill. And that is something that people at an institution like Princeton should have. And the people who govern society, and above all, maybe the occupant of the Oval Office, that the trend toward competitive victimhood as a way of gaining power has left Americans in a situation where no one is willing to say, among all the, we actually here, we are the non-victims. We're the non-victims. And instead of competing in the victim contest, we're going to accept that we are the non-victims, and with that comes responsibilities. And we accept them. And we accept that this is the way societies always have been and always will be. And that is not something to be shirked. It is something to be embraced and shouldered. And that is why people like the present occupant of the Oval Office, who are for themselves, who do not accept responsibility, who are only appetite, why people like that we're so terrified, the founders of this republic. I've been spending, as finishing this book, and here's where I'll stop and open this to a conversation. I've been spending a lot of time as I write this book, which is not about Donald Trump the man, but about Donald Trump as a system of power. Not about, if you on the cover page of the book is a silhouette of Donald Trump, a caricature silhouette. And the book, I saw that drawing early on. I realized what I'm doing here is I'm not interested in the bright part of the silhouette. I'm interested in the shadow. I'm interested in the outline by which this silhouette is enabled. How, not where he comes from, but where does his power come from? How is he supported and enabled and allowed to govern? That has been probably the greatest failure of American governance that I can remember. And yet it was something that the people who founded the Republic anticipated and wrote about. And I've been spending, as I write the book, a lot of time with them and with their premonitions about the country and about the presidency in particular. A powerful presidency is necessary to make the American national security system work, and that system is necessary for the peace of the world. But it is also the lethal flaw, design flaw in the American government, the booby trap that was there all along. And now that that trap is closed upon us, and we have to find a way to pry it open again and to restore a spirit of public spirit, of nationhood, of commitment to country first, and to wrench from the lying mouth that utters it the true meaning of that slogan, not America first, but Americans first. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to have some conversation and take questions.
So we have two standing mics here. As always, we ask the students to come down first, if you could, and ask hard questions.
Hello. Thank you for coming out today. I had a question on one of the things you brought up. You talked about the future of, what a future conservative looks like. Do you feel like if someone were to run in the mold in which you described, they would be able to make inroads in areas like LA or San Francisco or places that are currently very deep blue kind of areas? Or would you feel like it's just targeting it toward people who are currently conservative, just shifting them more to the left?
Well, at the local level, that is where this kind of politics could be most powerful, especially in a place like Los Angeles. Los Angeles, if you spent time there, is a terribly governed city. That is systematically failing to meet the needs of its population. The mundane things, water, transportation, parks and recreation, the schooling system is a catastrophe. And this is where those flinty-eyed questions of value for money, of making sure that the city is run not in the interest of its providers, but in the interest of its citizens. This is where Republicans have a lot to contribute. And the Republican brand in LA is going to be poisoned for a long time. So I don't know that the forces of conservatism there will be able to use the word Republican for a while to come. But yeah, I think that it is precisely that one of the things that has been a problem for conservatives. We did such a good job of solving the problems in the 70s and 80s and 90s that what we wanted to do is take endless victor's laps and go on stopping inflation over and over again. But when you get it down to like zero, you're done. You have to go home. And come on back. I'll hit you again. But at the local level, that is precisely where I think there is the most to give.
Thank you.
Hi. So you're a part-time DC resident. You're a conservative, and you're somebody who, based on your comments today, clearly has some pretty substantive issues with the character of the governance of President Trump. So that tells me that you must have colleagues, peers, professional people you work with who think that you're doing the wrong thing by even trying to work within the system at all, by even trying to defend conservatism or republicanism to any extent. How do you even begin to answer those people who say that you got to burn the whole thing down, you got to start from some ground zero?
Yeah. Well, because I never believe in burning. Something is always better than nothing. There is always something to build. You have to, I think there have been some weird gifts from the Trump presidency. That's the last chapter of my book, not just dampen anybody's appetite, but there have been some weird gifts. And I think one of them is a discovery of the importance of things that are, and how they need to be protected. And even if they're sort of defective. Like I work in the media. I can criticize the vices of our media institutions all day long. I'm sure you have many, but I promise I have more. Yet, we need them. And by and large, and they do more good than bad. And they have to be protected in the same way. I mean, look, the Republican Party, believe me, I know its vices and its corruption better than you. And the conservative movement, I mean, it's going to need a detoxification of the most profound kind. And it has been a moment of testing. And one of the things, I mean, to be personal about this, one of the things that I have found as I see friends and colleagues who go on one side or another of the Trump line, that one of the strongest predictors is how do you react when you see cruelty? And are you horrified by it, or are you kind of a little excited by it? And one of the things about us as a species is we do get excited at the sight of cruelty. That's why the gladiatorial games were a success in Rome. So I see all of those things, but you have to start from what you have. And you can't build I mean, you know, that you can't write imaginary constitutions in the air. You have to start with the one you have. You can't build new parties. You can't work with different people from the people you have. You have to work with them as they are, take them as they are.
Hi, thanks so much for coming. So you mentioned that sort of this degradation of what it means to be an American, this affinity for American institutions. A lot of this has been brought about by this massive migration of foreign-born people over the past few decades, and that this has contributed a long way towards the decline of what you consider to be true conservatism in the mainstream. And so I guess my question is sort of, you know, if we look at these people that have been degrading these institutions in the past year or two, I mean, many of them are not these foreign-born people, right? And so how exactly are you making that link?
Because what happens is changes breed reactions. Now, look, I don't think it is, I hope I've been clear. The corrosion of democracy has come from people who feel fear. Who feel that their world is changing, and changing in ways they find threatening both economically and culturally. That's the story of the Trump era. I think I've been pretty emphatic that the thing I worry about most is, and the greatest danger, is the conservative-minded part of the country turning away from democracy in reaction to the changes it sees all around it. And that is not a uniquely American event. That is happening in almost every single developed country, where we're seeing the rise of more or less explicitly anti-democratic parties. You see it in Poland. You see it throughout the Visegrad countries. You've seen it in France. You've seen it in Germany a little bit. As changes come, people react to changes, and they react often as they find themselves in a society in which they perceive themselves to be a beleaguered tribe. They act more tribally. So it's not a simple morality tale where, you know, I don't think you write about politics in terms of good people and bad people, villains. I think people often act for motives that are embedded in human nature. And so one of the things, if you suspect that people will act in a certain predictable way, it's going to have negative consequences. You have to head them off. Robert Putnam, I think, who taught at Princeton for a time, did he not? Robert Putnam wrote this famous essay on what are the effects of rapid diversification of a neighborhood. And what you see is decline in social trust, decline in social cooperation, decline in willingness to share. People are less likely to serve on a jury in a rapidly diversifying neighborhood. They're less likely to join the PTA. And maybe you criticize them and say, well, you know, you shouldn't be the tribal primate that you are. But we are primates that wear pants.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I wanted to touch on a point that you made about the need for competition to win democratic consent. And you mentioned also that the Republicans have a huge amount of political power, but they don't have the cultural economic power. And I would also add in the power in terms of population and numbers, which are pooling more and more in large cities.
Yes.
And you know, this is a result of the electoral college system, obviously, that the Democrats aren't winning the presidency, even though they have the popular vote. So this is the second election in my lifetime in which this has happened. And as a young person, you know, at the getting MPA, it's kind of disempowering, and it really causes one to lose faith in their democracy when you know it's not truly democratic. And I just want to couple that with the historical reality of why we have that system, which is because of slavery and the slaveocracy. And you mentioned victimhood several times, but I feel that there are some like truly unsolved issues where people genuinely were victims in America, and it's all coming to a head now. And if we were able to tackle those demons and create a more equitable society, we wouldn't be in this position because we wouldn't have the Electoral College, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, these issues are really intertwined and are they're devaluing our democracy, you know, in many capacities. So I don't think it's so easy to just say, like, don't be a victim, because I see a direct correlation between victimization of humans and Donald Trump as president.
Look, again, to repeat this, I mean, I think that a lot of Donald Trump's appeal comes from the enjoyment of cruelty. I think that was something the fascist party, I'm not calling Donald Trump a fascist, he's not, but the appeal of that kind of politics appeals to people they like cruelty. But the inspiring thing about human beings is they hate the sight of the consequences of cruelty. And that's how you inspire them, is you confront them with what cruelty does. And that's how you get them to be something better. And that's why I think these moments with the soldiers, widows, and mother this week are so powerful, that you know, to see human pain and loss, and to see someone insulting toward it, that's very politically powerful. The Electoral College, you're not going to do anything about it. It's not going anywhere. And so if your political idea is like, first we do this impossible thing and then other good things follow, I'm going to tell you, I don't think that's political. You know, and I mean, certainly, I'm not gonna, if you're an academic and you're working on the Electoral College and its consequences, and it's, you know, write the paper, God bless you, we'll all learn from it. But it's not going anywhere. And it's like the Second Amendment to the Constitution. You know, I don't think of gun ownership as an important civil right myself. But that's my opinion. It's there. It's in the Constitution. And large numbers of your fellow citizens think differently. And if you're going to reduce gun violence and the consequences of it, especially from children, you don't start by saying, well, first we do the impossible thing, and then we, you know, come up with some policies. You have to work around the world as it is. And maybe that's what maybe conservatism is also a disposition. It's a personality temperament. Do you work with things do you take people as they are, work with things as they are, and try to make the best of what you have? You know, it's an interesting question to think about, do parliamentary systems work better than congressional systems? But that's what you have. That's what you have. You have to start from where you are. You're not going to be able to get rid of it, because the Electoral College empowers the very states that you need to agree to dispense with the Electoral College. And they're not going to say yes. So absent some kind of constitutional revolution, it's there. And so you have to work with it. And by the way, I think you can achieve a lot of things that would make a healthier democracy. It's an easy thing to blame precisely because it is so immovable. But you could have you can imagine a world in which political parties are stronger. And one of the things that has been exacerbated the bad tendencies that are within the Electoral College is that Republicans have increasingly seen opportunities to put together presidential coalitions without competing in the larger states. But if you had a different kind of party system, they might think differently. So I would focus on the doable, not the undoable.
Hi, Mr. Frum. My name is Zach Walls. I'm in the MPA program here with Cleo. And I want to start by saying thank you, because you actually retweeted me a few weeks ago.
What did you say?
I shared a chart showing the spike in the deaths of suicide, drinking yourself to death, and overdoses over the last several years. And the reason I bring that up is because it's related to this question of, is Mr. Trump a symptom or a cause of, I think, the rot that we've seen within a certain part of our society? And the thing that I can't stop thinking about, and this haunted me throughout the 2016 election, I'm a Democrat. I was watching the debates and the primary process go on, and I just kept thinking to myself, you know, the party of Lincoln is going to nominate Donald Trump. And all of the various Republican candidates didn't train their fire on Mr. Trump, except maybe for Jeb Bush, who came out swinging kind of early on. But everybody else didn't want to attack him directly because they wanted his votes. Or Ted Cruz, wanted to be his buddy until,
Right.
And so could you just... I mean, it almost kind of defies belief that we have to say that, Trump accused Ted's father of, being the assassin of JFK, and then starting to spill the beans on his wife, and then Cruz endorsed him for president and the whole deal. But to what extent do you see Trump being a kind of a symbol of the symptom or the cause, and why?
I'll say something about the Ted Cruz and the Kennedy assassination. So my wife's late father was a fabled Canadian foreign correspondent, and on the day that Ruby shot Oswald, he is 20 feet along that wall.
I've seen the image.
If you see the widest image of that famous shot, what you'll see is on your left, there's a very slim, very good-looking, dark-haired man with his foot on the wall, and he hears the bullet, and this is Peter Worthington, he hears the bullet go, and of course he turns and runs toward the bullet. So he's at one point, he's about 6 feet outside the last of the series of photographs. He's about 6 feet away, and so the widest would capture him. The result of that has been that my wife's family has spent decades in the coils of the Kennedy conspiracy cults, because he is often identified as being somehow, because there he is running toward Ruby at the moment the Ruby shot's out. He must have known something. So I can only imagine what it's like for Ted Cruz. And you never get, once these people fasten on you, you never escape their coils.
Well, aren't the papers coming out? Are they being unsealed soon? Or?
Yes, we'll all soon know the truth, yes. But as to what is Trump is cause, he is symptom, and he is also maybe solution. So here's, I try, when I look on the bright side of this, that he, sometimes we inherited this incredible structure of stability and peace and prosperity in the years since 1945 from parents and grandparents who built it. And when you build a structure, the work of maintaining serious as the work of building it in the first place. Every old building takes constant repair. And it has been neglected, and we've taken a lot of risks. And I open my book by talking about the ways in which, the Republicans are the worst offenders, but there are plenty of Democratic examples too, of ways in which people have been playing games with the political system that have become more and more destructive. The most spectacular, of course, was the risk that were taken with the debt ceiling in 2011 and 2013. But there are others as well. That the filibuster of Merrick Garland is part of a revenge cycle of escalating attacks on judicial nominations, in which the Democrats have bloody fingers. When in 2005 and 6, Democratic senators put holds on appellate nominees to President Bush. There had never been a filibuster of an appellate judge before. It was done to this group of a dozen judges under President Bush, and that was, in this revenge cycle, that then became the basis for the Republicans to say, and that's why we're going to do this unprecedented thing to Merrick Garland.
It goes all the way back to Bork.
And it goes back to Bork, and then there will be another spin, and this, you have to find a way out of the cycle. The only way, as Leonard Bernstein showed us at the end of West Side Story, the only way you break out of a revenge cycle is that something sufficiently terrible happens that everybody realizes we have to get out of this cycle, that the payback machine is going to leave everybody dead. And so that's the hopeful thing with Donald Trump. I mean, that he brings us to our senses and shows us what the possibilities are. But yeah, look, a healthy party system exists. There are always adventurers. And there must be hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people in the United States, who are politically opportunistic, who have some charisma, some money. The system's supposed to weed them out of serious office, and it failed with him.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much again for the wonderful talk. I'm Sam Harshbarger. I'm from a local high school. And my question is, given the increasing climate of polarization that we've seen across the country and the politics of burning bridges becoming a real forefront, where do you imagine this new conservatism arising within our current political landscape?
It's going to arise after a bunch of Democratic wins. The Democrats are going to win a bunch of things. They're going to veer pretty far to the left. And they're going to govern more of the country the way Los Angeles and New York is governed. And it's going to be expensive. It's going to empower unions and providers at the expenses of taxpayers and consumers. And if all goes well, there will remain enough competitive democracy in the society, and it's always under challenge, and Donald Trump is making it worse, that people who are on the other side of that are going to say, we're not socialists. Whatever neoliberalism means, we're that thing. We like markets. We like low taxes. We want value for money from especially our local governments. And you'll see a reaction. The Republican ascendancy owes a lot to the weakness of the Obama recovery. Democrats are then going to gain a lot from a national revulsion, especially. I don't think there'll be a huge national revulsion against Trump, but just enough to tip things to a stronger Democratic Party. And out of that, I think a lot of people in your generation are going to have the experience of saying, you know what, this is no way to run a railroad, or whatever the 21st century equivalent of a railroad is. And we want a value for money. That's where it's going to start. The strength, I think, conservative politics at its best is non-ideological politics, and so its strength is always where politics is least ideological, at the level of local government.
Thank you for your talk. You mentioned that one of the goals for conservatism would be kind of promoting national identity. Mm-hmm. So not necessarily putting America first, but putting Americans first. And you mentioned it's not necessarily that Americans are the best in the world, but it's good to promote this type of identity. So you necessarily didn't say the phrase, but it seems very close to what civic nationalism would be, which inherently isn't a bad term, I would argue. However, obviously the term nationalism, especially white supremacists, the alt-right, the far-right wing, have kind of stolen that word. So how can a conservative try to promote the sense of civic participation, civic nationalism, and that it not be confused or potentially appropriated by those on the far right?
Well, look, as you know, I don't use those words because partly because they're too complicated and hard to understand. They're like our friend neoliberal. The whole now to get there's a famous phrase applied to nations: imagined communities, because the truth is, from some larger philosophical point of view, like what does it mean to be an? And these are very arbitrary boundaries. They are heavily constructed in the mind. It took us a long time to believe in them. For most of human history, we followed tribal leaders, tribal chiefs. When it was the thing that I worry about, that you point to, is as we have tried to make human loyalties wider, we have in fact made them narrower. And one of the reasons why the alt-right and types like that are attracted to Vladimir Putin is what they're saying in effect is, I have more in common with Putin because of race than I do with my fellow Americans of a different race. That's why that conversation in the Trump Tower could go the way it did, and why it could not have happened in 1976. Because in 1976, being an American really meant something. And as it's meant less, we have not become citizens of the world. We've become trapped in more ethnic identities. And that you're seeing that all across the continent of Europe, this revival of ethnicity as the way of organizing a society. I think in looking back on it, the division of the Czech Republic into two pieces was an ominous indicator of what is to come. That's what's happening in Spain right now. It's threatening to fragment on those kind of ethnic and linguistic lines. And the kind of imaginary community that is a nation state is an alternative to that, because anybody can become an American if they, it takes some time, it takes some commitment. You can't do it in one generation typically, but it's open to all. It's not an exclusive identity. And if you say, we need to get beyond the nation, I'm afraid you're going to, instead of going beyond it, you will fall far short of it, and you will turn us back into tribes. That is, I think, probably my most fundamental dread. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I have this 1929 dictionary, which I use words to find out what they used to mean. So, and as a retired journalist and writer and editor, I'm very concerned about the fact that especially decisions by judges have changed the meanings of words. And I'm wondering how you react to that as a journalist and what you think about that.
Can you give me an example so I understand more clearly what you have in mind?
Marriage.
What is it?
Marriage.
Marriage.
Conception.
So one of the things that I have a son who's a very conservative in the sense of the word that he hates change of all kinds. Painting his room, anything like that. My wife is an inveterate builder and is always making changes, and he's always upset. He's feeling like his childhood is being destroyed. And so I tell this personal story because of something, this is how I learned. I had to explain to him, if you leave things alone, they don't stay the same. They fall apart. And the only way you keep things as they are is by constantly fixing them. And so the essence the essence of the conservative project, and the thing that distinguishes the conservative project from the reactionary project, is to understand how you have to adjust to change in order to channel change, because change is a fact. You will never hold things in the form that you knew them. That if you want to preserve the essence, you have to be prepared to, and we've had a lot of fights about this, but you sometimes have to repaint the room. I was not an early adopter of the idea of same-sex marriage, but I've come round to it, in a pretty convinced way, because the thing that worried me when the debate was introduced in the 1980s and 1990s was if you changed the concept of marriage, I could see the decline of marital stability in non-elite America. If you change the meaning of this concept, won't that accelerate the decline? And so then for a decade, actually, the conservatives tended to win the fight, and that same-sex marriage was held off. I mean, it began to be talked about seriously in the early 1990s. It didn't become the law of the land for 25 years. And yet marital stability among working-class Americans collapsed anyway. Even having won the argument, effectively, it collapsed anyway. And so looking at this collapse, looking at a world in which the majority of American children will not grow to 18 with a single parent, with a father and a mother in the same house, in a world in which today fewer Americans under 30 live with a spouse or partner than at any time since record keeping began. We're looking at a collapse of the institution of marriage that happened even in the years in which the more conservative-minded people were winning the argument on same-sex marriage. And that tells me that winning the argument on same-sex marriage was not going to accomplish any of the things that I really cared about. And then it just became an act of bullying, because why say no to people who have an authentic problem when that no does not achieve the ends that the no is advertised as achieving. So there are other things and I look at this, to my mind, what has happened to marital stability is one of the major calamities in American life. It's just another way that for the for the non-elite Americans that things have deteriorated, and they are the people by whose happiness a democratic society is judged. That is a huge, huge problem. But you weren't going to solve the problem in the way that in 1992 I might have told you would solve the problem. Yeah.
We have a hard stop in 10 minutes. 2 more questions. If we have more time after that, we'll keep going, but we really do have a really hard stop at 5:45. Right? So you two, and then we'll see really quick.
Hi, my name is Tarana Walsh. I'm an MPA student here at the Woodrow Wilson School. Thank you for being here. My question is, you spoke to the need for a new synthesis and a new political map, which struck me as kind of the refrain after Romney's defeat so many years ago, which I think we've received an answer to in the recent election. And I'm wondering, as somebody who takes things as they are, what you see as a viable political strategy going forward for conservatives, American conservatives.
All right, well, I know, I don't know whether it's my intensifying senile decrepitude or what, but I find myself citing old things I've written more and more often, which is kind of frightening to me. On the Thursday after Romney's defeat, I published an electronic book called Why Romney Lost. And although I write fast, I do not write that fast. So I saw that defeat coming. What happened after the defeat was, this happened literally within 72 hours. And in the new book, I sort of chart this, how the Republican Party, donors, intellectuals, all coalesced on an explanation of what had gone wrong and what must be done. And this was given most forceful expression by the syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer, who said what the party needed to do was adopt Jeb Bush-style immigration reform and change literally nothing else. Everything else was great. Change nothing else, just change that one thing, and you would win. In other words, so Romney ran on a platform of withdrawing the Medicare guarantee gradually from everybody under 55. Romney ran on a platform of putting Medicaid on a path to where it would eventually vanish. Romney ran on a path of making Social Security less reliable for most people. And Romney ran on a platform of using the resources liberated by these things to fund a military buildup and a giant tax cut at the top of the market. And I mean, under those circumstances, getting 47% of the vote was a pretty damn impressive achievement, because the more people knew about that, the less they would like it. And my argument was, by the way, I voted for Romney. I believed and believe he would have made a very fine president, but he was saddled with this completely impossible platform. And the solution that the party convened was to take the one thing in the platform that the people provided most of the votes for the Romney coalition liked, and get rid of that, and keep all the things that they had hated, and to build. I keep saying the Republican Party, the vision of it for the authors of those autopsies was that the Republican Party is a coalition of the country's biggest winners from a more globalized world economy and the country's biggest losers. And the deal they reached was the winners would supply the agenda and the losers would supply the votes. And this was obviously, it seemed to me, an unstable and unworkable thing. So the new map, the map I have in mind is, we have to learn from Donald Trump. Demagogues don't become demagogues by talking about things people don't care about. And Donald Trump saw a lot of the same things I saw. He talked about how he was going to keep Medicare. He was going to keep Medicaid. He was going to preserve Social Security. There were going to be some tax cuts, but they were going to be not so top-heavy. And he was going to ensure that people got, as he called it, fabulous health care, which is maybe over-promising, but adequate. Adequate would be good. That's the kind, and a lot of Republicans believe that if you ever had a more universal approach to healthcare, that's it. We've reached the tipping point, we're in the land of socialism, and we'll never win another election. And I just keep pointing out, the most successful political organization in the democratic world is the British Conservative Party. They have won more elections for longer than any political party. And they have been stronger since 1945, when Britain got universal health care, than they were before 1945. And the Canadian Conservatives are very competitive, and the Australian Liberals, who despite their name are the Conservatives, they're very competitive, and the Nationalists in New Zealand. And in fact, that in all the countries where there's some form of universal health care guarantee, Conservatives have done better than they have done in the United States since 1992. And the reason is, when you identify the single biggest source of anxiety in the lives of people and you redress it, they become more conservative. They have more to give people. You can't be a conservative unless you have something to protect, unless you are basically satisfied. Fearful people may cling to things, but they do not have that sense of stable, generous protection. That is the essence of conservative politics. I think that's what the map looks like. And I think, and then there are other areas we can, once you've addressed that, then you can look at some of the other areas where modern society, people's terror of education costs, of the costs of elder care. And in all those cases, a party of the right can say, you know what, these things are so high because America has the most lavishly funded providers of these services in the world, who have built, sorry to Princeton, but anti-competitive systems to create artificial scarcity to keep the prices up. And those are integral elements of the Democratic Party's coalition. So if the people who are not getting the votes from the providers of education and the providers of healthcare are ideally positioned to be the voices of competition to basically to redistribute from providers to patients, from providers to students.
Hi, thank you for coming to Princeton and thank you for your talk. So you split society into victims and non-victims and alluded to the responsibilities of the non-victims. And I was wondering, in your opinion, as a conservative who just started studying at Princeton, what are those responsibilities for the non-victims?
Well, it's the message taken completely non-ironically of Nick Carraway's dad. And to say, first, I mean, I was being a little sardonic there. I mean, I think it would be better if more people thought about their advantages in life and their blessings. There's a lot of, by the way, research that shows the more you think about your blessings, the happier you are. And no matter how disadvantaged you are, that there's nothing worse that you can do for people from the point of view of their, is to get them to focus on their troubles, because we all have them. You, me, the Koch brothers have grievances, I'm sure. I mean, I'm sure one of them is dyslexic or something, or depressive, or his children don't appreciate him. And he's got a story. So I would say focus on your response and say, you know what, when people say, what about all these privileges you have? You say, yeah, I got them. Not giving them back. I'm going to use them. I'm going to use them to do some good for others. And that means I'm going to, play a part in public life. And I'm going to accept that I've got an opportunity to have some leadership role. I'm going to accept that and live, and I'm going to be that. I'm going to approach that leadership in the sense of service, not take what I can get the way our present leader does. It means that after you certainly fight the political battle to set the level of taxes at a more reasonable level than is set now, but then once you win that battle, you pay them cheerfully, and you enforce the laws, and you make sure that evasion is properly punished. And it just, that one of the reasons that that the tax return story with Donald Trump is so troubling is I would expect somebody who wants to be a leader of this republic to be able to show a record of cheerfully paying his reasonable share. Not to be a chump about it, obviously, but you can't lead if you haven't contributed. You can't be a general if you haven't been a lieutenant. You can't, but I would say it means not leading a privatistic life. I mean, if you are one of those who is able to take full advantage of all of the amazing possibilities of modern America, what a fabulous time to retreat into your own private concerns. The food has never been better. Go to Thailand for vacation. All of human knowledge is at your disposal on your cell phone at reasonably moderately gouging charges. And you can just retreat from all of the hurly-burly and unpleasantness and of dealing with people who have demands and complaints and sadnesses. Overcoming that desire to withdraw is the beginning of it. I think that we have been trying through high schools to encourage, and I know that's admission policies at elite schools try to encourage students to do service. You know, I think these admissions departments are getting a little wise that the children who take their parents' money and fly to Kenya and incompetently dig a well with no water in it are not doing anybody any favors except putting local well diggers out of work. But, you know, if we were to encourage our young people to do things like visiting the nursing home closest to them, you know, volunteering in hospitals close to them, you know, actually learning that by serving others, it will make you happy as well as entitle you to play a part in the role of in the leadership of your society. Thank you.